afterward. Forgive me, Mr. Mason, can you turn this on? This isn't the start. Hi, everyone. Good evening. We're not starting quite yet, but there is coffee and water in the room adjacent here. So if you need to get a quick coffee, we have a couple of minutes, and then we'll get underway. Ready? Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I'm Brendan Boyle, Associate Dean for Graduate Programs at St. John's College, and I warmly welcome you all to the Great Hall of St. John's College. I especially welcome our guests from the Carey School of Law, tonight's distinguished lecturer, Professor Max Stearns, Dean Renee Hutchins-Laurent, last year's distinguished lecturer, Professor Peter Danchin, and the staff members who worked behind the scenes to put this event together, Allie Amerson, Shara Boonshaft, and from our own president's office, Bruce Douglas. Thank you all very much. We gather here this evening to listen, learn, and perhaps most importantly, talk with one another. And we do so inspired by the spirit that presides over the happy relationship these two institutions, St. John's College and the Carey School of Law, have with one another. That presiding spirit is Alan Hornstein. There was, I am led to believe, nary a soul as committed to talk as was that presiding spirit. I was delighted to have come across in my study of Mr. Hornstein a lovely verse tribute to him, one which, as those of you who have read it will know or were here last year may remember, has as its ringing refrain, "Say more." I can't help but quote once again a little bit from it. Here it is. But the Allen still beguiling all my sad soul into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of man and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what kind of seed or spore, what kind of germination and gestation rises out of every pore when Allen croaks, "Say more." That, it seems, was Allen's invitation to others, to say more, to talk more, all that we may learn more. We attempt to do that in our own study at St. John's College, focused as it is on conversation and exchange governed by civility and reason. And I trust that this is the practice at the Carey School of Law too. So joyful has been the talk that I have shared with its faculty and staff in the days leading up to this evening. But perhaps I should not call Mr. Hornstein the presiding spirit of this relationship and this evening, since that word, presiding, does not have any etymological connection to the speech, reasoned and civil, of which he was so fond. Would it be better, if not somewhat ungrammatical, to call him the parliamentary spirit of this relationship and of this evening? For that adjective has within it the verb, parler, to speak. And speaking, it seems, not presiding, is what Mr. Hornstein did best. But aside from the grammatical impropriety, that word, parliamentary, is somewhat foreign to these shores, belonging rather to a distant political situation that this American democratic republic left behind. We, Allen Hornstein accepted, are quite content, it seems, to preside. But I should also, I think, accept tonight's distinguished lecturer, Mr. Max Stearns, professor of law at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law and the author of Parliamentary America, the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy. Though I cannot profess to know Professor Stearns well, he seems an appropriately parliamentary spirit for this evening, insofar as my happy exchanges with him have made me think that he, too, is one given to, committed to, parler, talk, among fellow citizens of a democratic republic. And that has been confirmed by the many other lectures and podcasts of his that I have enjoyed in the months since I've known that he was to be tonight's lecturer. And so, though Parliamentary America sounds to my own presidential ears a bit like parliamentary spirit, it takes a bit of getting used to. I trust that by the end of the evening, we will be reminded of the centrality of talk, maybe even parliamentary talk, to our polity and the institutional structures that such talk requires. If we accomplish this evening under the wise guidance of Professor Stearns, I count that a fitting tribute to the parliamentarian who brought us here, Mr. Hornstein. And we do so in this fitting venue, the Great Hall, a venue completed in the early days of the Democratic Republic. A republic with a presidential spirit, to be sure, but, I like to think, one forged in a spirit of camaraderie that welcomes the frank and open exchange of ideas, a spirit that welcomes, in a word, talk, a spirit that may well be parliamentary in the etymological sense. And so with that, I invite our distinguished guest to do the rest of the evening's talking about talking, the author of Parliamentary America, the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy, Professor Max Stearns. Great to
have you. Well, thank you, Associate Dean Boyle. Thank you, although she's not here, President Demleitner, and of course my own wonderful Dean, Renee Hutchins-Laurent, and so many other people that I would like to thank. So what I'm going to do to keep it shorter on the thank yous is second, enthusiastically, all of the thank yous that Brendan kindly provided, and know that I sincerely mean that. It has been a pleasure to coordinate arranging this lecture with this fine institution. And I have to say, as an author of a book who is also a law professor, it's really truly a special honor to give a book talk at a school whose principal mission is reading and discussing great books. It's hard to think of a higher honor than the opportunity to engage with all of you about this book project. So I published this book, Parliamentary America, the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy, in March of this year. And in the interim, since the book was published, some stuff's happened. Quite recently, I wrote a piece that's forthcoming in the Maryland Law Review Online. The title is Kamala Harris's Ironic, now you have to visualize this, capital D / lowercase d, picture that, Kamala Harris's ironic democratic, right, coronation in genuine electoral reform. So some things have happened in the interim. The remarkable event of having the nominee for one of the two parties that is actually capable of having elected somebody who will occupy the highest office in the land and, frankly, the most powerful office literally in the world, the presidency, the U.S. presidency, despite the fact that there hasn't been a single vote in a primary or caucus for her to represent the party as the head of the ticket. That large / small d ironic democratic coronation has substantial implications for thinking about the thesis of my book, Parliamentary America. And in fact, I believe that this event doesn't undermine my thesis, in a significant way bolsters my thesis. But at the time, and I will explain why, but at the time that I was writing this book, which has been a 4-year labor of love, and I mean that, we were looking at an election between two candidates who, I think it's fair to say, the majority of Americans were not happy with the choices presented to them. So we had Joe Biden, obviously our sitting president, who was the oldest person to head a major party nominee, and who many people thought was experiencing some personal deficiencies that compromised his capacity to fight the fight that they thought that he would need to win. And on the other side, we have, of course, Donald Trump. And I think to say that he is a quite controversial American political figure is rather an understatement. He is somebody who was twice indicted, albeit not convicted. He faced 4 sets of criminal indictments and then went on to actually be convicted on 39 counts for a particular set of criminal indictments that most people didn't think was the most serious set. In fact, it was a question in many people's minds whether that should even be pursued, given that there were others that were more significant. He was held civilly liable for aggravated sexual assault, and I think we can say that he played a significant role in an attempted insurrection designed for the first time in our history to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. And in the period in which we were looking at an election between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I think a lot of people looked at that and thought, as this is shaking out, this is going to look potentially more like the election in 2016 than the election in 2020. And so a lot of people were deeply anxious about where we were headed. And for a period of time, well before then, I had come to the conclusion, having taught constitutional law, this is my 33rd year teaching constitutional law, so I think I could say for a very long time, I've been teaching it longer than the age of most of my students by a non-trivial amount. Yeah. So, yes, it's true. So I had come to the conclusion some time ago that America's democracy was facing a constitutional crisis. And for a period of time, people thought that I was being hyperbolic in saying that. In the interim years, more and more commentators, whether academic commentators, media commentators, or others, were beginning to see that we are facing a constitutional crisis. And they were beginning to float quite a number of ideas about how they thought we could extricate ourselves from that crisis. Some of the most popular ideas that have gained public attention include ranked choice voting, multi-member at-large districts, congressional term limits. While we're at it, term limits for the Supreme Court too. Replace the Electoral College with the national popular vote, perhaps via an interstate compact, which actually is presently underway. So, as I looked at those proposals, I identified a couple of really significant problems. I was quite convinced that if any of these proposals were actually enacted, they would not solve our constitutional crisis, but I was equally convinced that none of these proposals could actually be enacted, which is kind of a too big strike against the proposals that are on the floor. And that alone would not have motivated me to write this book. I would not have been motivated to write a book because people finally are coming around to the idea that we're in a constitutional crisis, and I think their proposals don't work. But as I thought more deeply about it, it occurred to me that there is a way out of this crisis, and the way out of this crisis is one that actually has the potential to achieve what's most vital, and that is enactability. And at that point, I realized not that I wanted to write a book about how to save our democracy, but that I had to write a book about how to save our democracy. And so let me explain briefly the arc of the book. The first part of the book tells you how we got here. And that includes going through some, sort of familiar cultural references and games. I'll go through some of those with you this evening. To explain to a general audience, and although Johns Hopkins University Press published this book, it's on their trade press side. It is written for an audience of concerned citizens about the state of our democracy. And I wrote it with that in mind. So the first part of the book tells you how we got here. The second part of the book is the conceit of the book. It's the heart of the book. I take you on a virtual world tour to 7 countries. I take you to England, France, and Germany in Chapter 5. I take you to Israel, Taiwan, Brazil, and Venezuela in Chapter 6. And let me say this. The book is $35. Actually, you can probably get it cheaper. I'm a pretty good tour guide. It's a good deal. When you travel no, sincerely, I'm willing to say what's true. When you travel to those countries, having read this book, you will have a deeper appreciation of your experience there. You will have a deeper understanding of how that country's system operates differently from ours and others across the globe. After taking you on a virtual world tour, having given you the tools to understand what you're looking at on that virtual world tour in terms of different electoral systems, I explain how we can extract the most attractive features of those systems and make them our own, with the goal of producing a genuinely thriving multi-party parliamentary democracy here in the United States. That is 3 constitutional amendments for each of the 3 changes, and I explain them in considerable detail at the end of the book. I actually give drafts of those amendments. And then in the final part of the book, I explain what the world will look like if we achieve Parliamentary America, what we can accomplish going forward in a finally genuinely thriving multi-party democracy as our legacy, not just to ourselves, but to future generations who will get to live in a thriving United States. Now, early on, I have to introduce three concepts to understand some of the framing issues: the third-party dilemma, the fact that I'm claiming we're in a constitutional crisis. I have to sort of explain what I mean by that, and the concept of American exceptionalism, which I have no doubt is a term that pretty much everybody's familiar with. But let me talk about what I've described as the third-party dilemma. You see, we have a system of two-party presidentialism. But the fact that we have a two-party system doesn't mean that we don't have third, fourth, fifth, or more parties. That's not what a two-party system means. A two-party system doesn't mean you don't have more parties. What it means is that when you vote in support of those parties, you are punished rather than rewarded for doing so. And everybody pretty much knows this, right? We learn this from our childhood, that if you vote for a candidate who is to the, this is my right, so it is your left, to the left of the Democratic candidate, or to the right of the Republican candidate, you are supporting what's referred to as a spoiler, throwing support to the candidate that you least prefer as between the two candidates who actually have a shot at winning the presidential election. Or alternatively, if you have a candidate like a Ross Perot who threatens, or John Anderson, who threatens to pull in votes from both sides, there wasn't a good name for this. I call it a randomizer. Somebody who, by pulling in votes from both sides, renders the choice between the two major candidates, who again are the only ones who really have a shot at winning this thing, an effective roll of the dice. So one thing that we have to do is overcome the third-party dilemma. But I also have to defend the proposition that we're in a constitutional crisis and what I mean by that. So let me say what I don't mean by that. I don't mean a situation in which I or any of you are just unhappy with the results of our politics. Politics will leave people unhappy all the time. And that's usually a sign that it's working well, if we're honest about it. So I have to be much more specific about what I mean by a constitutional crisis, and the constitutional crisis we're in is the third of our constitutional crises. The first constitutional crisis was the period through which we ridded ourselves of our original Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, in favor of what we today call the Constitution, or at least the first draft. It's actually been through some iterations since then. So the first constitutional crisis is superseding the Articles with the Constitution. The second constitutional crisis is the period through the Civil War and aftermath, the period of Reconstruction, ending in 3 constitutional amendments that fundamentally were intended to transform the relationship between the states and the federal government, although it took upwards of 90 or 100 years for them to actually begin to achieve their intended mission. And we are in a crisis today characterized by 2 major parties whose centers or modes are demonstrably being pushed further and further and further apart, to the point that whereas at points in our history in my lifetime, we could imagine people with whom we disagree about certain fundamental political issues having read the same source materials as we did, but coming in good faith to a different set of inferences from what they read. Today, by contrast, we believe, whether we are liberal or conservative, that those who occupy the other side lack fundamental intelligence or are evil. And this is wreaking havoc not only with our political system, it is wreaking havoc with our culture. The final concept I want to introduce right now is American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is what we raise our children in this country to believe. And the story goes something like this. As we look at the world around us, most democracies have had constitutions that have lasted for an exceedingly short period of time. By contrast, a group of brilliant and wise men met in Philadelphia, and they produced a document that we call the Constitution, that has since been ratified, and we've had it for 235 years, and it must be the case that something wise and brilliant embedded in that document, the Constitution, So sets it apart because it has lasted so much longer than any other written constitution across the globe. Okay? But there's a problem with that, and we're going to get to that problem later. And one of the central missions of my book is to demonstrate the flaw of American exceptionalism, to demonstrate that the duration of our Constitution might well have been in spite of its design instead of because of its design. And a way to think about that is, what else might have allowed us to endure for that period of time? We are geographically isolated from foreign military threats, unlike other countries across the globe. We had an influx of highly motivated immigrants throughout most of our history. Of course, we had the original sin of enslaved persons brought here under unimaginable conditions and retained here in a state of abject brutality for centuries. And of course, we had the possibility for westward expansion, manifest destiny, at tremendous cost to Native American communities, but in a way that, again, other countries didn't have the capacity for that kind of growth because they hit up upon borders of folks that were less fond of their expansion. Okay? And it may be, in spite of the constitutional design, that our system has lasted as long as it has. Here's just a thought experiment. Okay? If you were thinking about the wisdom and efficacy of a system, any kind of system, it could be an engineering scheme, it could be a business model, it could be an artistic genre, it could be anything. Would you think that the ultimate test of wisdom and efficacy is, can I find an example of that system that has lasted longer than others, or would the test be, is this a system that has been benignly adapted across varying situations again and again and again? My gut is that most of you would go with the replication test, not the isolated example test. The truth of the matter is that we are alone on the world stage. We have exported democracy, but never successfully exported two-party presidentialism. Successful democracies across the globe are characterized by proportional representation, coalition governance, and parliamentary selection of the head of government. My three proposals will achieve that for the United States. I propose 3 amendments that affect reform on the 2 vital axes that every single democracy in the world necessarily confronts. 1, how you elect the lower legislative chamber, sometimes the only legislative chamber, and how you select and hold accountable the head of government. And my proposals are, number 1, to double the House of Representatives, creating a new body of people within the House of Representatives elected in a different way by party, while also keeping all of the districted folks in the House of Representatives. And then that second amendment, which is the most radical of my radical amendments, and they're all radical, creates a mechanism for up to 5 parties in descending order of representation in the House to negotiate a majority coalition with the pre-designated president and vice president slate from the successful party, assuming those offices on a very fixed calendar. So unlike democracies that are parliamentary, with which you're familiar, that keep cycling through elections and never get anywhere, my system recognizes the problem and has a backstop. We will have a government on a fixed calendar, which is the same calendar we have now. And the third amendment creates a mechanism, finally, for the effective removal of a fundamentally problematic president through a vote of no confidence for maladministration, and I explain and define the concept in the book. In order to explain how we get to these proposals and why they are enactable and will solve the crisis, I want to take you to your childhood. I want to take you to the playground. So we're going to go to the playground from middle school. And I realize for a lot of people, middle school isn't the happiest memory of their education. And maybe even this won't be the happiest memory, but I promise I'm going to take you to another playground that's happier later on. But here's the game, and you probably all remember it. Rock, paper, scissors. The rules are really, really simple. Okay? The idea is that scissors cut paper, paper covers the rock, rock crushes the scissors. When you go from the middle school playground to your middle school math class, you'll be introduced to a concept called transitivity. Here goes. 10 is greater than 5. 5 is greater than 2. And yes, 10 is greater than 2. And I see my dean nodding because she was a math major at Spelman College. So she is proud of me right now. Okay, thank you. All right, so here's the thing. Many relationships satisfy transitivity, but the reason rock, paper, scissors works is because it doesn't satisfy transitivity. You see, scissors beat paper, paper beats rock, but rock beats scissors. We call that a cycle, okay? Call that a cycle. The framers of the Constitution thought that they were inventing a rock, paper, scissors Constitution. Here's how it works. Congress can send a bill to the president, but the president gets to veto that bill. So the president beats Congress. Everybody with me? Okay. The Supreme Court can strike down bills that the president really likes or executive orders if they violate the Constitution. So the Supreme Court beats the president beats Congress. Through transitivity, the Supreme Court beats Congress, except Congress can overturn ordinary statutory rulings with a regular statute, and it can initiate a process for overturning constitutional rulings. It's one of the two means of amending the Constitution. So the Supreme Court beats the president beats Congress, Congress beats the Supreme Court. But actually, the framers of the Constitution created a more confounding game even than that. You see, that's a cool game because for any option you pick, another option could defeat it or potentially be defeated by it. But they came up with an even more confounding game, which we can call scissors, paper, rock. It's going to go like this. You see, it's true that the president can veto a bill sent by Congress, but it's also true Congress can override a veto with a 2/3 vote in each house. So Congress gets to beat the president. And the Supreme Court can strike down bills enacted by Congress. So the Supreme Court beats Congress, Congress beats the president. That means the Supreme Court beats the president under transitivity, go Renee, except the president has this immense power to appoint new justices to the Supreme Court, changing the direction. So Supreme Court beats Congress, Congress beats the president beats the Supreme Court. It would be like adding this additional set of playground rules, okay? Now, the scissors sit on top of the rock punctures a hole in the paper, and the paper covers the scissors. So now whatever option the child puts out, rock, paper, or scissors, another option, any other option, could either be defeated by it or defeat it. So the framers of the Constitution thought they created a rock, paper, scissors, scissors, paper, rock Constitution. Maybe the better way to think of it is that they thought they created a unicycle Constitution. Here's how it goes. Don't think of a bicycle. Bicycles will mess you up because if you are riding a bicycle, momentum, and you pedal backwards, you're still going forwards. Wrong metaphor. On a unicycle, if you pedal forwards, you go forward. If you pedal backwards, you go backward. The cycle goes in both directions. The framers of the Constitution thought they created a unicycle Constitution. And even beyond that, they thought that they created a leveled Constitution with federalism. And here's the rub. They really thought that everybody in this system was going to be so committed to their institutions that the jealous rivalries would be defined in an endless rock, paper, scissors, scissors, paper, rock game that would never end. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, and if you're in good faith, that's okay because it's all fair. And that's the game. And by the way, one real benefit of that game is it's really hard ever to get anything done, which they thought was a really good idea. Okay. There's only one problem. It's not true. And the reason it's not true is because the framers of the Constitution constructed a system of election for the president, in particular, that actually created a game that overwhelmed rock, paper, scissors, scissors, paper, rock, or the unicycle Constitution. They created a system of election for the president, albeit filtered through the Electoral College, in which one person is going to occupy that office. And voters come to realize again and again and again, Chapter 3 tells the entire history of our two-party system, that in that game, the only way to win is to keep your side intact and fracture the opposition. That's mutual. The other side knows the only way to win is to keep your side intact, fracture the opposition. Any of you see the movie A Beautiful Mind or read the book? So I'm going to get geeky here. Here goes. The pure Nash equilibrium is a two-party system. Only two teams are going to win. And what we've experienced throughout our history is that the jealous rival games are, in spite of the institutions, motivated by the party. Your affiliation with a party, even if it's the president in another branch, you are more jealous of protecting him, so far always him. Hopefully we get to change that someday, and I'm not making any political statements here, right? And the folks who you are opposed to are in the same institution as you, the other party. And so the rival games between the parties have overwhelmed what the framers thought that they had constructed. All right. But it gets even more complicated than that, and I now will take you to potentially a happier playground. Now we're going to go to the preschool playground, and children like that. So here's the ride. It depends on what part of the country you're from. You either call it a seesaw or a teeter-totter, and it's a really simple game. Flat board on a fulcrum in the middle, balanced. One child on one end goes up, the other kid goes down, vice versa. This one goes up, the kid goes down. Okay, lovely, lovely ride. But let's picture that seesaw completely flat. And let's think of how that's a metaphor that we all kind of intuit about our politics. And we do. And so the idea is, again, this is my right, so it's your left. So we have a candidate to the far left, we'll call that person the Democrat, on one end of the seesaw. We have a candidate on the far right, we'll call that person the Republican, on this end of the seesaw. And the intuition is that in order to get more and more support, they're going to move gradually toward the center, what a political scientist would refer to as the median voter. And the choice for the voters is, as Ross Perot, as Ralph Nader claimed about George W. Bush and Al Gore in the 2000 election, oh, it's a choice of Tweedledee or Tweedledum. Now, of course, that was absurd by any measure. There was actually pretty considerable policy distance between Al Gore and George W. Bush in 2000, although there was certainly far less political distance than between Donald Trump and any of the three people he ran against, whether we're talking about Hillary Clinton in 2016, Joe Biden in 2020, or now Kamala Harris. Greater distance. Let's go in the other direction historically. The distance between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon was less than Gore and Bush. And if you go back even further, here's a cool fact. In 1952, the two major parties courted the exact same person to head their ticket, Dwight David Eisenhower. A couple of other cool things to know about the 50s, okay? Number one, the American Political Science Association published a major study of the two-party system in the 1950s. And guess what the major critique was of the two-party system by the APSA, the biggest political science association in the world? Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Insufficient choice, insufficient distinction. The voters don't have a meaningful choice. By the way, the APSA just revisited that study and came to diametrically opposed conclusions in a more recent period of time. But there's another interesting historical development in that period of time, which, by the way, you great books folks should know about, a great book. Anthony Downs is an economist, and he wrote a book called An Economic Theory of Democracy. Anthony Downs popularized the seesaw metaphor that I just gave you. A simple line, left is liberal, right is conservative, and what we would expect is the candidates to converge on the median, okay? In the 1950s, that might have actually been fairly descriptive of our politics. But there's a couple of questions here. Why isn't it descriptive of our politics today? And why is it that we have the sense that the parties are growing further and further and further apart? And there's a couple of things to think about here. Number one, most political scientists reject the premise that we can define our politics on a simplistic, single, left-right line. Most political scientists, whether we're talking about the United States or other democracies around the world, believe that politics rests on two key dimensions. The way to think of this, I can do this. The way to think of it is a four-frame window, right? You've got windows here. Just picture the four frames. In the middle line is that horizontal axis, liberal to conservative on policy. The middle vertical line represents culture and identity. To the north, we're talking about nationalistic culture and identity. To the south, open society, globalism. Okay. When you put those two dimensions together, on the upper right, conservative economic policy, because that's to the right, conservative economic policy and conservative culture and identity, traditional Republican. Okay. Liberal economic policy, but conservative on cultural and identity, you can think of that as the traditional understanding of populism. Lower left, liberal on economic policy, liberal on cultural and identity, traditional Democrat. Lower right, liberal on cultural and identity, conservative on economic policy, traditional libertarian. Let's go back to the seesaw for a moment. So here's the thing. 2016, Donald Trump runs against Hillary Clinton. And there's a serious question in all of these elections, which is, should the candidate go further out to the base to get more base participation or further into the center to get crossover votes? But Donald Trump demonstrated that there's actually another strategy altogether. The seesaw strategy. You see, here's the thing. Picture the middle line as the seesaw, okay? And picture Donald Trump on one side of it, Hillary Clinton, later Joe Biden, later Kamala Harris on the other end. Donald Trump isn't running a policy campaign. He is riding the seesaw upward toward nationalistic identity and culture. And when that happens in a two-party system, Newton's third law of motion becomes our first law of politics. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. As Trump rides that seesaw up toward national culture and identity, there is immense downward pressure on the other end of the spectrum toward more open society in a way that, in both cases, creates a profound effect on the electorate. You see, as the seesaw tips this way, centrist Republicans feel disenfranchised, so too traditional Democrats. In an earlier period where this thing was flat, progressive Democrats and nationalist Republicans felt disenfranchised. Now, I'm not going to take sides on this. In this particular case, maybe the only time, they're all correct. Every single one of those groups at some point feels disenfranchised when given only two choices in a two-dimensional space. The question is, can we affect a result with multiple seesaws so that you get to vote for a candidate who occupies a place in a quadrant that identifies with you instead of choosing between the lesser of two evils, election cycle in and election cycle out? The other question is, how is it that the parties have grown further and further apart? So one part of it is the fact that we have a two-stage election. We actually have primaries and caucuses before the general election, and you can think of the Republican primary as occupying, this is my right, so it's, no, this is my left, this is your right, is occupying the right side of the political spectrum, the Democratic Party occupying the left side, and we get some distance between the candidates. But what it doesn't explain is how it is that the distance gets further and further and further apart. But there's an answer to this, and it has very much to do with the information age. Two key dynamics in the information age, roughly early to mid-1990s, have messed with our Constitution in a profound way. One, we can look at a book written by David Daley that has the unceremonious title of Rat Effed. You can figure out what that means, okay? And what he tells is the story after Barack Obama's 2008 election of Republican operatives realizing that for pennies on the dollar, they could throw money at state General Assembly elections. And if they could flip enough blue and purple states red, because state General Assemblies draw the congressional maps, they could get a lock on Congress, turning it Republican and capture it. They thought for 20 years, it actually ended up being 12 before it flipped back. But that strategy called red mapping was matched with Democratic strategies called blue mapping, and the consequence of the combination of this hyper-partisan gerrymandering, which, by the way, the Supreme Court says that's fine, right? No worries there. That's okay, right? The combination is to render the vast majority of congressional races uncompetitive. That's not 100% right. You see, they're uncompetitive in the general election. They are competitive in the primary stage. If you aren't willing to feed your base, you will be primaried by somebody who will. And the consequence is to make blue states bluer and red states redder. That's one. Two, the manner through which we obtain news and news-like content in the age of social media does not bring us together, it pulls us apart. You see, the algorithms for places like Meta, Facebook, X, Twitter, TikTok, whatever, is rewarded by your active commitment and engagement to the page. And the way that that works is to feed you not up the center, thoughtful, neutral, balanced articles. It is to feed you information that affirms your sense that I am with the righteous tribe. That's one way to do it, but there's another way to do it. Feed you stuff from the other side that you and your righteous tribe get to condemn as the product of people lacking basic intelligence or evil. And so we have a dynamic loop in which gerrymandering pushes our politicians further apart. The news media push us further apart. We are further apart. And this endless cycle is not speculative. You can look at the Pew Research data. You can actually see from early 90s until now, the modes or centers of these parties have moved further and further and further apart to the point where we have campaigns consistently of denigration that aren't about policy, and they're tearing apart the fabric of our society. So what do we do? What do we do? In the world tour, I make two central points. Number one, there are two fundamental threats to democracies, either having too few parties or having too many parties. And I give examples of both. There is not and cannot be a perfect democracy. Winston Churchill was right when he said democracy is the worst form of government except all others that have been tried. But that's not just a statement. It actually finds ample support in Arrow's impossibility theorem, for which he got the Nobel Prize at the age of 42 in 1972. Every democratic system embeds some features that are necessarily anti-democratic in some way. But the two threats to democracy are too few parties. Why? Remember what I said, the winning strategy is to keep your side intact, fracture the opposition. That's mutual. That means neither party can give up any of their constituents, because if they do, they throw it to the other side. So if somebody comes in and begins to take over a segment of the party, you increasingly acquiesce, and that segment, that extreme segment, can redefine that party and eventually take over. But the equal threat is on the opposite end of the spectrum. If you have a hyper-fragmented parliamentary system, a candidate who gets more seats than any other, even if it's a small number, can roll over other parties one by one until seizing control of the government as a whole. That helps to explain the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany. It helps to understand the problems that Italy is facing today, and it provides great insight into what's going on in Brazil. What we have to achieve is the Goldilocks principle. Not too many parties, not too few. Most political scientists believe the sweet spot is somewhere between 4 and 8 parties. It so happens that the system that was devised for Germany after World War II, which is called mixed member proportionality, has special attributes that make it likely you achieve the Goldilocks principle. Here's how it works. You go in and you cast 2 ballots for the lower chamber, which in Germany is called the Bundestag. One is for what they call a constituency seat, just like a districted seat now in the House of Representatives. And remember what I said, if you have a single person being elected in a district, you're going to have 2 parties dominating. That's the pure Nash equilibrium. Each side knows it has to keep its side intact, fracture the opposition. But your second ballot is for a party. And then you use the party ballots to determine proportional representation. Now, one thing about Germany. Germans are incapable, viscerally, of keeping things simple. So they've come up with this elaborate, complicated scheme that uses national proportionality and allocates it back to the states, creating all kinds of mathematical and conceptual problems, including a variable-sized Bundestag. In fact, in March of 2023, they revisited it 3 days before my manuscript was due. Thank you very much. But I anticipated the problem because I realized we don't need perfect proportionality. We need good enough proportionality, and we can do it state by state. So imagine that you vote in 2 ballots in a particular state, and you are a progressive Democrat. Probably it'll be the Democrat or Republican representing the district. You're going to vote for the Democrat, but probably you will vote for the Progressive Party. You are signaling in a surgical way. Yes, I recognize the Democrats are going to run things. I want it to move in a progressive direction. Imagine that you are a traditional conservative. You might say, look, I'll vote for the GOP for the party election. I'm fine if the Democrats start the process or the Republicans start the process. I just don't want it to move in a MAGA direction. You see, our parties, 2 parties, really embed multiple parties. The Democrats probably break into traditional Democrats and progressives. The Republicans probably break into traditional GOP, and we can call it America First or MAGA. We probably have a Green Party. We probably have a Libertarian Party. We probably have 5 or 6 parties. This will allow you surgically to convey the direction you want the coalition to form. But the key benefit of this is, by doubling the size of the House and having a new cohort represented by, coming in by party with proportionality governing the entire institution, mine is the only proposal that allows every single sitting member of the House and Senate to keep their jobs. All of the other proposals translate to unemployment acts for sitting members of Congress. 2 ways to amend: Congress or a constitutional convention. We've never had the latter. They've all come through Congress. Congress has blocking power, and all of these proposals are unemployment acts for members of Congress. And most people don't vote to render themselves unemployed, right? Especially if they like their jobs, which for some reason Congress people seem to do. Second Amendment, once we have a proportional system, that means no party will systematically get a majority. You will have to form coalitions with others. Picture the difference in a campaign. Instead of the campaign of denigration that we have today, Republicans calling Democrats, I don't know, cat ladies, whatever they're calling them these days, and Democrats calling Republicans whatever, right? The campaigns would go something like this. I want you to support me. I think our party has the best vision, but I want you to know, even if I'm not your first choice, I can work with that other party because we share a common commitment, core value of democratic governance. Imagine how much better those campaigns would be. Imagine how much better you will feel voting for candidates that when you leave the booth, you actually feel good, not needing to take a shower, okay? And then the Third Amendment creates a mechanism for removal. I could talk about that in the Q&A, but I do want to allow time. I do want to allow time for questions. What I want to say is this: this book is a deeply optimistic book. I believe in American democracy. I believe we can be a beacon to the world. I don't believe we are one now. But I think that in order to be a beacon to the world, we have to educate the public that the proposals that people are discussing can't be enacted and won't solve the crisis. They won't genuinely create a multi-party democracy, because in order to create a multi-party democracy, it has to be the case that when you vote for a third party, you are rewarded. So let's say you are that progressive Democrat, and you vote for the Progressive Party, and you vote in the district election for the Democrat. Are you punished or rewarded? You see, you're rewarded. Here's why. The Progressive Party leader in the House will say to the Democratic negotiator or the Republican negotiator, I'll join your coalition, but here's the deal. You have to give me these policy concessions. You might have to give me a cabinet appointment. You might even have to give me a seat on the Supreme Court. You are suddenly rewarded. You don't get everything you want, but you get something you want. By the way, that's called politics, at least when it's played well. Let me close with an anecdote before opening for questions. So a few years ago, while I was writing this book, I happened to be doing a trip, and I was in Israel, and there's a site, an ancient ruin site called Apollonia National Park. It is north of Tel Aviv, south of Haifa. It is right on the Mediterranean Sea, and it's a beautiful spot. And I am going through these ruins, and as I typically do when I go through ruins, I try to think of what the lives of the people who lived there might have been like. But at the time that I was writing this book, another thought kept occurring to me. You see, I was reading about the cultures that lived there, and there were 5 ancient civilizations come and gone: the Illyrians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Mamelukes, and the Crusaders. And I thought, I'll bet every single one of those societies thought they were the ones that would be there forever. We humans struggle to realize how fleeting it all is. Democracy is eminently fragile. Thinking that a group of people who met in Philadelphia nearly a quarter millennium ago got everything right because our system lasted longer is not the way to leave a legacy for future generations of a thriving democracy. We have to take this crisis as seriously as the last 2, and we can. Thank you very much. So I don't know how you want to do the Q&A. I am happy to take any comments or questions.
Can I start by asking a question about the...
Absolutely.